My name is Manfred Helber and I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in the category Cloud and Data Center. This session will be a full, complete live demo session where we have a look on how to prepare hosts for the installation of Azure Stack HCI, how we install Azure Stack HCI, and what steps are required in our Active Directory domain. So let's switch to my live demo environment, and we can see here I have several virtual machines on this host because I will install Azure Stack HCI in two virtual machines. I will install Azure Stack HCI in these two virtual machines. The D102 environment is the demo environment we will use for this video, and there's also a domain controller already prepared. It's not part of this video series to how to configure a domain controller. I think you are familiar with this, and I think most of your customers already have an Active Directory domain. So we will have a look if there are at the domain controller, if there are required steps to prepare this for the Azure Stack HCI installation, and we will have a look at the Azure Stack HCI nodes themselves. As you have learned in the module about hardware requirements, you know that we have some specific requirements for an Azure Stack HCI host. The recommendation is to use physical servers from an Azure Stack HCI certified or with an Azure Stack HCI certified solution. For testing, for demoing, for learning, you can use virtual machines. My virtual machines are configured with 8 GB of memory. I will not put a lot of virtual machine workload there. It's only for demoing, installation, and architecture. I have 4 virtual CPUs. Actually, I only have one drive for the operating system. We will add additional drives together in the next steps. And actually, I only have one network interface card. We also will add additional network interface cards and discuss what is the role of these interface cards. Because I've enabled nested virtualization for this machine, I disabled the checkpoints and I switched the power off action for the automatic stop action for the host to power off for the virtual machine. And I've already downloaded the latest version of Azure Stack HCI operating system. This can be done via microsoft.com/HCI. There you can register for it and download. As you have learned in the module about licensing, you don't have any upfront costs. So you have the hardware or using virtual machines, and you get a free download for the bits and bytes for Azure Stack HCI. I will connect to this virtual machine and start the virtual machine and boot from this ISO file here. So when I boot from this ISO file, the first step is to select the language, the time and currency format. I always prefer to install the English language version, but because I have a German language keyboard layout here, I will switch to German time and currency format and keyboard input method, also German. Then in the next step, I will select to install this operating system here now. The setup is starting, setup is preparing. Usually you know that you are requested to input a product key here, and you are requested to select an installation option. Here we only have to accept the licensing terms, and then I can select to have a custom installation. I select the unallocated space, and now the installation starts. I will do the same on the second node. If you have many nodes, you have to deploy all these nodes. There it could be an advantage to select an system where you receive the Azure Stack HCI OS pre-installed. Talk to your hardware vendor. Many of these Azure Stack HCI certified solutions are offered by the OEMs with an Azure Stack HCI pre-installation. In the integrated system, we have always a pre-installation. In the validated nodes, it depends on what you order from the OEM and if the OEM provides this pre-installation of Azure Stack HCI there. We can see it looks like a traditional Windows Server operating system setup here on the first machine, also on the second machine. If you remember the module about the Azure Stack HCI basics, there we learned that we have the server core installation here. So we didn't have a screen where we could choose between graphical and server core installation because it's clear it will be a server core installation there. While these machines are installing, let's have a short look at the domain controller for this environment where we will add these two Azure Stack HCI nodes later. And for additional modules, you can see I have many more Azure Stack HCI nodes in my Hyper-V Manager here. These are all virtual machines I will use for Azure Stack HCI for demoing in different videos. And I will add all of them to this Active Directory domain. The name of the domain is mhdemolab.de. The domain is already configured. It's a virtual machine also. I have a virtual domain controller. And if I use this traditional tool, Active Directory users and computers, yes, we also can use Active Directory tools in Windows Admin Center and in Active Directory Administrative Center. But for what we have planned, it's very easy to do it via the via the Active Directory users and computers tools. When I look to the computers, I can see actually I don't have any members in this domain. We only have the domain controller and that's it. Now let's go back to our two Azure Stack HCI nodes. And the first one has already finished the installation. The first step is to provide a password for the local administrator on this machine. I will provide this password here, so I will confirm with an OK. I will provide my password. It should be based on your password policy you provide in your environment. And then the password has been changed, and after logging in, I will see here that I can configure the machines via the sconfig tool, the server configuration tool here. Sconfig is loading. Here on the welcome screen, I can see it's Azure Stack HCI. We are actually in a in a work group. It's a random computer name. And we have different options here to choose to configure this Azure Stack HCI here. Let's start with a combined domain join and naming and renaming the machine. So I can choose the option 1 and then decide via a D to join the domain. You can see D for domain, W for workgroup. I will use the D for the domain. And the name for the domain is mhdemolab.de. And now I have to specify a user that has the required rights to add a computer to this domain. Usually every user in the domain can do this if we use the default policies. If we change anything at the policies, we have also to change this here in using another username. mhdemolab/administrator. I will use my administrator and I will specify my password. Joining the domain, and yes, I want to rename also my node because domain join and renaming the node requires a restart. I will do this in one step. Yes, I will rename this computer. And the name, it's based on your naming convention. My name here for this computer is D102-ASHCI21. I have to specify my password again for this user because this one is now used to rename the computer account in the domain. And now I will do the restart on the machine. Yes, restart. Now we have the advantage that I'm using virtual machines. In physical hosts, you have more power, you have more scalability, you have it more real life scenario regarding the network performance and so on. But this virtual machine is very fast in restart. We don't have a power on self-test, hardware checks, and so on. So for testing and demoing, we save a lot of time in virtual machines. And so this is a good idea to use them. Okay, I will authenticate here, but not with a local administrator. I will press Escape again, and then I can select for another user because now I'm in the domain. This Azure Stack HCI host is domain joined, and I can authenticate here with the administrator at mhdemolab.de with the password PA$W0RD. This is my default password here in this demo domain. And now we are logged in again. Now with a new profile, so we have to wait a few minutes. And then we have again the sconfig tool. Let's check the next steps. I didn't change any network settings. The network settings would be helpful to specify an IP address if I'm not using DHCP. Let's check this when I enter the option 8. I can see here, okay, this IP address is provided by DHCP, everything is fine, but I could also select the interface 1 and set a network adapter address via 1 and switching from dynamic configuration to fixed IP address. In a production environment, I would do this. In this demo environment, it's fine to use dynamic IP addresses to save the time to always entering the IP addresses in the domain. So I want to cancel this. Then let's check date and time. Let's go to option 9, and here we have the date and time settings. You should change the time zone because we have some issues in Azure Stack HCI when you are working with wrong time zones. As you have already heard in the Azure Stack HCI Basics module, we have to register Azure Stack HCI in Microsoft Azure. And if you are working in the wrong time zone, you will run into issues. This is the reason why I'm changing the time zone here to my region. For sure, you can use your time zone, but I will change it here and save the settings. This is interesting what happens here, because when I enter this option 9, a window opens. So server core installation does not mean that I have no windows. It only means I don't have a full graphical user interface. I have a reduced graphical user interface. Okay, date and time, telemetry settings. Telemetry settings are very helpful for Microsoft to provide information about this cluster, not about your data, no about your private stuff or your customer's private stuff, but about the usage, how you use the Azure Stack HCI, what issues you maybe have, how you configure the services. So I would recommend to help Microsoft in turning on the telemetry settings, but for sure it's your choice. What I usually not understand, I often talk to partners and customers, and they complain that there are things not working as they expect or that they would change things. When we then discuss the telemetry settings, I often hear, no, we don't turn on telemetry settings. Then I'm wondering, because the telemetry settings are exactly for this. If you are always running into issues with a specific configuration on your Azure Stack HCI, then Microsoft will realize this, because usually then you will not be the only customer that runs into these issues, but many customers will run into issues. Then Microsoft will change something because they know it. If you don't report any information to Microsoft, they even don't know that you have Azure Stack on your host. This is not completely correct because you have learned in the Azure Stack HCI Basics module that we will have a connectivity to Azure for billing, for this billing subscription, but Microsoft will not get any insights about the usage of your system because it's not your private data, it's only technical information. I would recommend to provide this. Okay, we could exit to command line to the PowerShell via option 15. I will not do this here. We can add additional local administrators and so on. I think this is fine so far. We have an option 6, install updates. We will not do this here because we have later a module about deploying Azure Stack HCI in different scenarios. And there we will see there's an update management, and we have also an additional module that describes how to install updates for Azure Stack HCI. And there we will see how we do this in Windows Admin Center. So now let's have a look at the second host. Same steps for the second host. This machine number Azure Stack HCI 22. Let's click on Control Alt Delete. Then I will specify a new password. I already mentioned the password I'm using in this demo environment here. It's this Microsoft complex default password we often also see in Microsoft lab scenarios. Then I'm back in the machine, and again, to repeat these steps, sconfig is loading the server configuration tool. And I will choose option number 1. I will join the domain. I will join the domain mhdemolab.de. I will use the mhdemolab.de / or without dot. It's possible to use the .de administrator. So one important thing, the deployment wizard we will use later to deploy an Azure Stack HCI cluster is also able to join the nodes to the domain. I would recommend to do this manually before you configure the Azure Stack HCI cluster if you have a smaller environment like I have. For sure, if you have many clusters with, for example, 8 or 16 nodes in each cluster, many stretch clusters, then you will do the steps with the Windows Admin Center wizard, because then the advantage is that you'll save a lot of time in automating this. Here for these 2 nodes, it's great to do it manually, and I also will rename the host. The new name is D102 ASHCI 22, and the password for the administrator that is allowed to change this. And I need a restart even on this Azure operating system, Azure Stack HCI. So this didn't change since Windows NT server here, but I think this is no issue. And I will log in with the domain administrator here, not because it's required, we can do everything remote, but only to check if the machine is ready and to change the time zone. Windows Admin Center sometimes runs into issues if you don't use the correct time zone, and the Azure registration sometimes run into issues. So my recommendation would be to do this manually to ensure everything is fine. For sure, you also can have an automated deployment for your Azure Stack HCI nodes. What we are using here, let's change option 9, date and time, and change the time zone. What we are using here is the latest Azure Stack HCI version 21H2 for production environment. You already can test the Azure Stack HCI version 22H2 if you join the preview program. The preview program is available for everybody. You don't have to be the special customer or a special job role. You just have to join the preview program, and then you can already test, not in production, but in evaluation environments, what the next Azure Stack HCI version will bring. So let's check again our domain controller. We did this before. And let's have a look at the computer account here. And we will refresh the computers here, the computers list. And we can see, yes, now these two machines are in the year. We have the node 21 and the node 22, and they are in the computers container. If they are in the computers container and they stay in the computers container, then everything is fine. But in several customer scenarios, they will be in another container. Let's imagine we have here a new container, a new organization unit. It's called HCI clusters. So when I now move these computers to the HCI clusters, it's important to ensure that we break the policy inheritance before we move the machines, because it might happen that we receive a lot of unwanted policy settings from the domain. So what you can do, you can use, for example, your well-known tool, Active Directory group policy management. Here we have the group policy management. And in the group policy management, we can see our forest, the domain mhdemolab.de, and my new HCI clusters. And I can select here with a right click in the options, the block inheritance. With the block inheritance, I have the situation that I will not execute, I will not work on policies that are maybe in the domain or another level. Maybe the HCI clusters is part of the servers or servers worldwide. You know, we can have a hierarchy here with this organizational units, and via block inheritance, we can ensure that the other group policies will not have an impact on this container, except the policy is enforced. An enforcement breaks the block inheritance. So what the important message is, you have to ensure that you don't have any unwanted policies on this HCI clusters containers, because if you have unwanted policies, you can have unexpected behavior for these machines. So now when we move the machines, we have the situation. Let's move them. Yes. We have the machines here, but important is to know when we now build a cluster, there will be a new object for the cluster. We can prepare it here. So it's possible to create the cluster computer object, the cluster service object in deploying the cluster, when we deploy the cluster, or we can prepare it here. I could say, okay, let's create a new computer account. The name for it is D102 minus a Azure Stack HCI cluster 01. Or not 01, maybe we have 01 already. It's the cluster 20. It's for the nodes 21, 22, it's the cluster 20. Now I confirm with OK. Now the important step is that this cluster computer object will need to create additional cluster services objects if we create additional high available services. And so this cluster object here has to be configured with the requested or required security privileges for this HCI cluster container. To be able to do this, I have to go to properties and I will see, oh, there's no security here, because if you have a standard configuration of Active Directory users and computers, you have to switch to view and then advanced features. In the advanced features, when you have activated them, you can go to the HCI clusters, the properties, and now we have the security. And now you can say, okay, in this security, I will add, and I will choose the object types, computers. It's important because computers are not in the default result set. And I will add the D102 minus ASHCI cluster 20. This one I will use. And this one will be will have the rights to create child objects, to delete child objects, and to read the content. If you are in a highly secured environment, you could decide to not do this in this default security tab. I will remove it here, but go to advanced, where you can configure the security settings more granular. So let's go to advanced here. And in the advanced settings window, I can add this principal. I have again to select the computers. I can specify this D102 minus Azure Stack HCI cluster 20. But now I have more granular rights. What we need is create computer objects and delete computer objects. What it will build are computer objects. You can see you can configure it here absolutely granular. We can have a look at the properties, and we also need to delete the computer objects, create computer objects, and we have the read properties. So many step-by-step guides provide the default security settings, and I'm absolutely fine with them. But if you want to configure it perfectly, you only need this specific rights here. And then we can see, okay, we have this specific granular special permissions. Okay. Now the cluster is able to configure this additional service accounts we will need for additional cluster future services. Now, when we want to use this account, it's important that this account is disabled. Actually, we don't have a cluster. We only have the two nodes. So I will disable this account. And this ensures that the wizard that configures this cluster will be able to pick up this name of the node and reuse it as a cluster name. We will see the steps how to configure a cluster later in the demos when we deploy Azure Stack HCI with Windows Admin Center. The two computer account objects are already in the required organizational unit. If you now want to configure additional policies on this HCI cluster container, this depends on your needs. This depends on your configuration. What we have seen is the minimum configuration set on the nodes and on the cluster. Now let's talk a little bit about the architecture. We installed Azure Stack HCI OS, and I mentioned actually we only have one drive, the operating system drive, on each of the nodes. What I will do now, I will add 4 additional drives and some network interface cards. I could add the drives by adding hard drive here. This is a possible way, but I could also use PowerShell to optimize this. Let's take a PowerShell script I've prepared. This PowerShell script here will provide some variables, a file path, a file name, a server name, controller number. I will use virtual hard disks with 4 terabytes of size, and I will add 4 drives to each server. Here I could specify another size, another amount of drives. This part of the script adds these drives to the servers in exactly the path where the virtual machines is placed because I specified this path here. Let's execute this script. Okay. And now I will see 4 new drives at this server 21. Let's check this. This worked. We'll check the server 21 settings. And yes, I have 4 new drives with a name HDD1, 2, 3, 4. This is exactly what I have specified in the script. This builds a name for my additional virtual hard disk drives. I will do the same for the server 22. I only have to change the values here. I could also build an additional variable for the server name. And I will execute this again. Okay. And now we will have this additional drives for this server 22. Let's check also the server 22. And we will see here perfect also 4 hard drives. Now let's go to the server 21 and discuss a little bit the networks. Actually, we have a network adapter where this machine is joined to the domain. We discussed the networking requirements in the module about Azure Stack HCI hardware requirements. So let's select the network adapter here and add one. And I will have one network adapter. It's used for SMB traffic. Because I want to have it redundant, I will add another network adapter also for SMB traffic. So the redundancy here can be discussed because these are virtual machines on a single host and I don't have really redundancy. But I have so many things here where we have some configurations to make it easier, the virtual machines, the virtual hard disks, and so on. Regarding the networks, I want to show in the modules later where we deploy Azure Stack HCI the different configuration options. And to be able to show all these steps in the network configuration in the deployment wizard in Windows Admin Center, I need 2 SMB adapters and I will need an additional adapter. I will add another one. And this another network adapter will also be connected to my domain network because this adapter is for virtual machine traffic. So regarding the networks, the first one here is my adapter. With this one, we joined the machine to the domain. We could say this is the management network. The next 2 adapters are for SMB traffic, and the last one is for virtual machine configuration. You know from the hardware requirements part, this virtual machine connection should be redundant, so minimum 2 times. The configuration for the live migration network should be a dedicated additional adapter, or we should have 2 adapters in the host that we team and where we build everything on the virtual layer. So it depends on your design, on your configuration, what the preferred option is here. This is my way how I will configure the virtual machines. I will apply this here and I will do the same steps on server 22. I could also use a script, but in the virtual hard disks, we didn't have to connect any dependency to virtual switches. And to ensure that you are familiar with what I'm configuring here, I will do this again manually for the 2 SMB adapters, and then I will add another one, and this one is again also connected to the virtual switch with the name domain for the virtual machine communication. So now we have prepared everything on these 2 nodes to be able to configure and deploy Azure Stack HCI on these nodes. But before we are ready to do this, we have to talk about the installation and configuration of Windows Admin Center